16 bodies. One night. And a river that pretended it saw nothing. Natchez, Mississippi. March 1853. The air smelled like rain and wood smoke. By sunrise, the Blackwood Plantation, 2,000 acres of cotton, cruelty, and silence, was a pile of burning ruin. Inside the mansion, blood-soaked French carpets. A family of masters, their heirs, and their wealthy guests lay slaughtered in their beds. Some died before they could scream. Some with eyes wide open, staring at the boy who ended them. Not a general. Not a soldier. Not even a man grown. A boy. A boy they branded like cattle. A boy they thought broken. A boy they taught cruelty, and who one night spoke it back more fluently than his teachers. The quarters whispered his name, the fields carried it, and the river swallowed the ash. They called him a butcher. Some called him a ghost. Slaveholders called him a nightmare that would not let them sleep. This is the story that history tried to bury, the night an enslaved boy became judge, jury, and executioner. Who was Jacob, the butcher of Mississippi? Why did his name vanish from the record books? And why does his story still haunt the Delta today? Subscribe now, comment your state below, and stay with me. Because stories like this, buried, burned, and feared, deserve to be told. Natchez sat high above the Mississippi River, looking down like a judge from the bench. In 1851, cotton was king, and kings need a court. The Blackwood Plantation was that court, columns tall and white, verandas wide as stages, roses trained to climb as if even flowers obeyed. People from town called it beautiful. People who lived inside it knew better. 2,000 acres stretched across the Delta, black soil rich enough to grow wealth and rot alike. That soil held more than seeds, it held secrets. Whispers buried shallow. Blood buried deeper. At the center stood the Blackwood family. Edmund Blackwood, 43, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, spoke of order, the way preachers speak of God. He kept journals filled with notes about what broke a man faster, hunger, sleep, or the loss of his children. He called it science. He meant cruelty. Catherine, his wife, floated through the halls with scripture in one hand and laudanum in the other. She looked soft but cut harder than most men. Her silence was a blade, sharpened on the backs of those beneath her. Robert, their son, 21, fresh from the University of Virginia, brought new words into the house: conditioning, efficiency, incentive. He believed he was modern. What he was methodical. Every lash, every order, every humiliation, he measured them like experiments. Elizabeth, 19, was beautiful in the way poison ivy in April is beautiful, bright, tempting, and lethal to touch. She laughed while others cried. She called Lucy her handmaid, pet. She tied ribbons on her wrists, then pressed irons to her skin and called it correction. But cruelty wasn't only in the family. The overseer, Jameson, carried his whip the way some men carry a cane. He liked the sound of it in the air more than the pain it left behind. He walked the fields at dawn, when mist clung to the stalks, waiting for an excuse to make the crack echo. Inside, the household staff lived closest to the family and farthest from mercy. Samuel, the old butler, polished silver until his reflection blurred. He kept his voice even, but his hands shook with years of silence. Martha, the cook, stirred pots with twisted fingers, broken long ago by lessons. Cakes came out perfect, her hands never healed. Lucy, 16, tried to survive Elizabeth's moods with a hum in her throat and biscuits hidden in her apron for boys who behaved. And Jacob, 8 years old when he arrived from New Orleans, 15 when he became part of the house. He carried water, polished boots, fetched bottles, bowed when told. But most of all, he listened. Every hinge that creaked, every drawer that closed, every key that moved, every sigh, every order. The house spoke a language of cruelty. Jacob learned it word for word. Edmund believed he owned everything on his land. But Jacob owned something else: silence. He could walk halls without notice. He could count steps in the dark. He could hear the rhythm of feet and know when to move. The Blackwoods thought he was a shadow. He was, but not theirs. The big house had its own weather. The front hall smelled of polish and pride. The study smelled of smoke and ink. The kitchen smelled of sweat and salt. And everywhere else smelled faintly of iron, the smell of blood that no amount of scrubbing could quite wash away. Evenings often became theater. Guests arrived, eager to watch Edmund explain his methods. He spoke about breaking wills as if lecturing on crops. Robert read from his journals. Elizabeth staged her cruelty as performance. Catherine sipped laudanum and scripture in silence. The men nodded. The women smiled thinly. The servants bowed their heads lower, their silence forced into ritual. From the quarters, the enslaved looked at the glowing windows and said nothing aloud. But they talked when the house slept. They said the family fed on suffering like others fed on bread. They said the house hissed at night, like it wanted to burn but had not yet chosen the match. Jacob listened to both worlds, the silence of the house and the whispers of the quarters. He saw Lucy's bruises. He heard Samuel's quiet tremor. He felt Martha's twisted fingers brush his hand when she passed him bread. He learned. He waited. Because a boy raised in cruelty learns two things early: pain can silence and silence can sharpen. The Blackwoods believed they owned Jacob, but in truth they had built something else. They had built the one who would one day unbuild them. My name was Jacob. At least, that is what my mother whispered before the fever took her. I was 8 when the traders came. I remember New Orleans like a fever dream, bright handkerchiefs snapping in the heat, sugarcane in stalls I could not touch, the sound of music sliding through alleyways. I remember my mother's hand, small and strong, holding mine until it slipped. When the sickness swept the quarters, her voice cracked with it. She called my name one last time, then she was gone. The next sound I heard was rope. The traders led me up the river, across water that smelled like mud and salt. I stood on an auction block where men tugged my arms, checked my teeth, opened my mouth like a horse's. The bids shouted fast, numbers louder than names. A hand rose higher than the rest. Edmund Blackwood. That was the day my world shrank to 2,000 acres of soil I would never own. At first I was sent to the fields. Too small for the work, too weak for the sun. Cotton tore my fingers, thorns tore my arms, and the overseer's whip tore everything else. But Edmund had other plans. He believed a boy was clay that could be molded. He said obedience was easier to teach when the back was still soft. So he brought me into the house. I became Robert's shadow. His boots to polish. His bottles to fetch. His cruel games to witness. Robert was only 21, but already proud of the books he brought home from the University of Virginia. Books about conditioning, efficiency, incentives. He read them out loud, then tried them on people. He said he was studying science. What he was really studying was suffering. Elizabeth had her own games. She was 19, all lace and ribbons, her laugh like a silver bell. She liked to play dress-up with Lucy, tying ribbons on her wrists, calling them decorations. But when the curling iron came out of the coals, the decorations became shackles. Pain was Elizabeth's favorite music. She conducted it with a smile. Catherine floated above them all, half in a fog of laudanum, half in scripture. She told me God loved order. I learned quickly that order meant silence when cruelty filled the room. And Edmund, he was the architect. He sat in his study, ink stains on his fingers, writing in neat lines about breaking the human animal. He called me obedient when pressed. He called me useful when I did not flinch. He did not call me a boy. The first time they marked me was for watching what I should not. Elizabeth's door was cracked. Lucy's scream carried down the hall. I should have kept walking. But my feet betrayed me. I looked. I saw the ribbon tied around Lucy's wrists, the iron pressed to her skin, the smoke rising with her cry. Elizabeth laughed. Robert stood watching, notebook open, measuring her agony like a teacher clocking a lesson. They dragged me to the study. Edmund's eyes were cold. Robert grinned wide. The iron lay glowing in the fire. They said it was for privacy, for respect, for obedience. They pressed it to my shoulder while 2 men pinned my arms. Pain lit me up from throat to toes. My scream hung in the drapes of that room. That night, fever took me high and refused to let me down gently. I lay on straw, shoulder burning, throat raw, body shaking. I looked up at the roof of the quarters where cracks showed stars. They looked like nails holding the lid of a coffin. That night, I learned that hate is a kind of heat too. And unlike fever, it does not pass. Days became years. The scar healed. The lesson did not. I grew taller, stronger. My hands steadied on trays of crystal glasses. My steps learned the rhythms of floorboards and hinges. My ears learned the difference between silence and sleep. Robert taught me things he did not mean to: how to load a pistol, how to cut rope clean, how to angle a knife when you wanted to scare without spilling blood. Edmund taught me to read his records, his neat lines that turned human suffering into columns of numbers. Elizabeth taught me what cruelty looked like when it wore perfume. Catherine taught me that numbness could be a choice. The house became my school. Every door whispered, every hinge sighed, every lock ticked like a clock. I learned which windows stuck and which gave way. I learned the overseer's footsteps, the creak of his whip before it cracked, the sound of his breath when he grew tired. They thought I was furniture. They thought I was silent because I was broken. What I was listening. What I was counting. At 15 I was two people. The Jacob they saw, obedient, bowed, silent. And the Jacob they never saw, watching, recording, holding every cruelty like ink on a hidden page. By 17 the ledger in my mind was full. Every insult was a line. Every lash was a number. Every scar was an entry written in red. And I knew even then that one night would come when the ledger would balance itself. The Blackwoods thought they had trained me. In truth they had only sharpened me. And the sharper the blade, the deeper the cut. Some houses breathe. The Blackwood house performed. Its walls didn't just shelter cruelty, they staged it. Edmund Blackwood loved an audience. On Sunday evenings the study became his theater. Guests arrived in their best coats, cigars tucked in pockets, minds hungry for spectacle. The parlor echoed with polite laughter, but the real performance waited behind Edmund's heavy desk. He called it instruction. He spoke of methods in a professor's tone, pacing with his journals open. Pain was not punishment, he said, but education. The human animal, he lectured, responds to humiliation more deeply than to hunger. Fear fades, but shame carves permanent marks. Men nodded, glasses in hand. Some took notes. Robert brought his own contributions. His journals were thinner, his words newer, but his cruelty was eager. He read lines about conditioning, about response and reward, about treating disobedience like a variable in an equation. His voice carried excitement, as if human misery were a discovery he could patent. Elizabeth made her entrance like an actress in silk. She didn't speak in theory. She showed. Lucy, trembling in her pale dress, stood as prop and victim. Elizabeth tied ribbons on her wrists and smiled for the crowd. A whip cracked once, not by necessity but by artistry. She pressed hot iron to skin as if painting. The guests gasped, then chuckled uneasily, then clapped when Elizabeth laughed. Cruelty in the Blackwood household wasn't private discipline. It was entertainment. Pain was dressed up and paraded like a new invention. The air smelled of iron and vinegar, of sweat masked poorly by tobacco. The room grew thick with smoke and approval. And through it all, the servants stood in silence. Samuel polished glasses that trembled in his hands. Martha brought trays with fingers that never healed straight. Lucy bowed, her humming trapped in her throat. Jacob, stood with my head bent, carrying bottles, carrying silence, carrying everything I could not yet release. I watched. Always. I learned the rhythm of cruelty, the whip's crack followed by laughter, the iron's hiss followed by clinking glasses, the groan of pain swallowed by polite applause. The guests believed themselves civilized. They wore polished boots and quoted scripture, all while watching a young girl's skin blister as though it were theater. What they did not see was me in the corner, counting. Not just seconds and steps, but debts. Each laugh, each note scribbled in Robert's journal, each sigh of Edmund's false wisdom, it all went into the ledger. Elizabeth once caught my eye as she pressed the iron to Lucy's arm. She smiled at me as if to remind me my silence was part of the performance. As if my obedience was applause. That smile stayed with me longer than the scream. Robert refined his methods daily. He whispered to me sometimes about experiments he planned. How long before hunger broke a man's will? How many lashes before prayer turned to curses? He spoke as if I were a fellow student, not realizing every word he gave me was another nail in his coffin. Edmund, too, confided in his journals, leaving them open on his desk. His handwriting was neat, precise. Pain is a tool. Sleep is a tool. Family is a tool. Hope, perhaps the greatest tool of all. I read those lines when I dusted, my eyes sliding over the words quickly so as not to be noticed. They thought I could not read. They were wrong. The house had its own language. Hinges whispered, locks ticked, floorboards sighed. Cruelty had its own language too, spoken in screams, in silences, in broken bones. I learned both. Catherine's part was silence. She sat at the edge of these gatherings, her eyes half-lidded from laudanum. Sometimes she whispered scripture under her breath, verses about obedience and order. The words floated above the spectacle like smoke. She didn't stop it. She never did. Her silence was consent carved deep. In the quarters, the enslaved spoke softly about these nights. They said the house hissed like a snake, feeding on pain. They said Lucy's scars glowed under moonlight, as if even the dark could not forget them. They said one day the house would burn because no building that swallowed so many screams could stand forever. I listened to those whispers as carefully as I listened to Edmund's lectures. Both spoke truth in different ways. One promised cruelty eternal, the other promised it could not last. By 17 I was no longer just a boy carrying trays. I was a shadow with eyes open. They thought they were teaching me obedience. What they were teaching me was vengeance. Every demonstration was a lesson. Every scream was a sermon. Every scar was scripture. When Lucy stumbled past me one night, her wrists raw and her hum silenced, she touched my sleeve for a breath. Her eyes told me what her voice could not. Remember. That was the moment I understood. My silence was not submission. It was a blade being sharpened. The guests applauded cruelty as science, as art, as order. But what they applauded most was their own reflection. They wanted to believe the world belonged to them, that pain was a currency only they could spend. What they never realized was that they were teaching me their language, one word at a time. And one night I would speak it back to them. Fluently. Cruelty was their theater. But vengeance was already writing the script. Some houses hum. The Blackwood house hissed. By 1852, that hiss grew sharper, meaner, and it always seemed to circle Lucy. She was 16 when Elizabeth decided her cruelty would be amusement. The ribbons, the irons, the lashes. Elizabeth called it correction, Robert called it method, Edmund called it discipline. Lucy called it pain. Her body tried to heal. Fever fought her from the inside, infection from the outside. Martha brought herbs, Samuel carried water, others offered whispered prayers. None of it was enough. Elizabeth still paraded her like a broken toy. Edmund brought guests to observe, calling it resilience. Robert measured her moans like numbers on a page. 3 weeks after the iron touched her skin, Lucy barely whispered. Sometimes she called for her mother, sold long ago. Sometimes she sang half a line, then coughed until her lips bled. Sometimes she just stared, eyes glazed, as if she was already walking somewhere far away. One dawn, her hand found mine. Her voice cracked into dust. "Tell Mama I tried." Then her chest stilled. We buried her in burlap because the family said wood was for the living. The ground was mean, the hole was shallow. No pastor, no scripture, just dirt, sweat, and silence. The quarters hummed a hymn too soft to carry. I stood at the mound until the stars faded and something inside me tore. It wasn't my heart, that had broken long ago. It wasn't my body, that was trained to endure. What snapped was the last thread tying me to mercy. That night I didn't cry. I didn't pray. I made a promise. Not to be better. Not to forgive. But to be exact. After Lucy's burial, the house grew louder to me. Hinges spoke. Drawers whispered. Shadows told me when to wait. I started counting with more precision. Steps from the servants' stairs to Edmund's desk. 32. Seconds between Robert's laugh and his sip of wine. 4. The squeak of the rifle cabinet key. Sharp, metallic, easy to remember. Samuel polished silver until it shone like water. Watching him, I thought, a blade gleams before it cuts and after it's cleaned. In between it is busy. The overseer tested me one afternoon. He cracked the whip near my face. The leather split air, but I didn't flinch. My eyes stayed steady. His did not. For the first time he looked away. That moment lodged inside me like a nail. Fear had changed its home. At night I stole scraps of rope, practicing knots in the dark, loops that tightened without pulling, binds that hid until strain revealed them. I studied locks as if they were puzzles. A door was not an obstacle. It was only a wall waiting for the right key. When my hands trembled, I pressed them to Lucy's mound. The dirt steadied me. I spoke to her there. I told her how Martha's biscuits burned and made us laugh, how Samuel's hands shook less some days, how the peaches were too sour this season. And then I told her about the night I was choosing, the moon I was waiting for, the hour when the house breathed its slowest. Every cruelty after Lucy's death went into the ledger. Every laugh, every order, every note in Robert's journals became fuel. Edmund's voice no longer sounded like power, it sounded like debt. Elizabeth's laugh no longer sounded like music, it sounded like a clock ticking towards silence. One evening, Edmund held court again. He told his guests pain was not the only tool. Hope, he said, is the sharpest blade. He believed himself a master of tools. But I already held one sharper, memory. Lucy's grave did not sink. It held, firm against rain and footsteps. I knelt there the night before her death's anniversary and whispered the only vow that mattered. I will leave a mark that does not wash away. The house hissed with cruelty. But inside me something else hissed back. They thought they had broken me. What they had done was build the boy who would unbuild them. Vengeance does not begin with fire. It begins with a map. Long before the Blackwood mansion burned, I carried its blueprints inside my head. I could walk the servants' stairs with my eyes closed, 12 steps, then 3, then 7, where the runner dipped and the wood didn't talk. I knew the rifle cabinet key hung behind Edmund's desk, 2 finger widths above the curve of the hook. I knew which window latches stuck, which hinges groaned only on wet nights, which floorboards could betray you with a sigh. Each detail was a stitch. Together they made the pattern of escape, and of judgment. I didn't plan in bursts. Bursts are noisy. I planned in whispers, in small thefts stretched across months. A paring knife borrowed for a minute, sharpened, then slipped back before sunrise. A coil of rope cut shorter, tucked into the loft where no hand reached. A single match taken from a box, then another weeks later until no one counted. Each theft was a breath. Breathe too fast and you choke. Breathe even and you can run forever. The ledger in my mind had grown heavy. Every entry balanced toward one night. But vengeance wasn't only numbers, it was strategy. I studied people the way Edmund studied pain. Edmund himself was proud, so certain of his knowledge he left his journals open on the desk. Pride could be bait. Robert was impulsive, quick to anger, easy to push into mistakes. His temper was a lever. Elizabeth was vain. She watched herself so closely that she missed what moved behind her. Her vanity was a blindfold. Catherine drifted through laudanum fog, her orders dissolving before they landed. She was a door left ajar. Even the overseer had tells. His whip cracked hardest when others watched. Alone he grew careless. I rehearsed without moving. Standing in the hall, I pictured myself stepping left on the rug's edge, right on the cool patch of wood, pausing when the clock clicked, moving when it ticked. I memorized not just the house's body but its pulse. The quarters whispered their own predictions. Some said the house would burn one day because no place could swallow that many screams without choking. They thought the fire would come from heaven or lightning or accident. I knew better. The fire would come from my hands. The date settled quietly like dew on grass. March 15, 1853, Robert's birthday. The perfect stage. Guests would arrive in their finest carriages, toasting cruelty, drinking deep. By midnight, some would leave, some would stay. By 3 in the morning, the house would sleep like a bloated animal. That was when the knife would wake. I sharpened the blade on a stone until hairs jumped from my arm before steel even touched skin. I coiled rope until it lay in my hands like a patient snake. I touched the matches, tiny suns waiting for their turn. The plan was order. Guests first, because their voices could run further than their legs. Family last, because justice deserved intimacy. In those weeks, I spoke often to Lucy's grave. I told her what I was building, the debts I was ready to collect. I told her I would not waste her pain. The dirt never answered, but it steadied me like her hand once did. Inside the house, cruelty continued as usual. Edmund lectured, Robert measured, Elizabeth laughed, Catherine drifted. They believed themselves untouchable. I bowed, I polished, I fetched, I listened. Each movement another rehearsal. Each silence another practice breath. One evening, Edmund read aloud to his guests from his journal. Observe the effect when children are removed before speech. Remarkable. The men nodded, cigars glowing. I stood behind them, pouring wine, and thought, remarkable indeed how quickly a pen can be turned into ash. The overseer tried me again, cracking the whip too close. I met his eyes and did not blink. He faltered. For the first time I saw fear move across his face. I tucked that away for later. The night drew closer. The ledger swelled. I carried it in my chest, heavy but steady. When the day finally came, I would not tremble. I would not hurry for speed, only for order. I was no longer Jacob the servant. Not Jacob the branded. Not Jacob the silent boy. I was the butcher they had carved into existence. The seed of vengeance had taken root. And soon the house that hissed would choke on its own smoke. Robert's birthday arrived with carriages rumbling up the long drive like a parade of pride. Lamps glowed in every window, laughter floated out into the cold March air. The mansion, so often a stage for cruelty, prepared for its grandest performance. The guests came dressed as if to court. Pearls clicked against glasses. Feathers bobbed with every laugh. Boots tracked dust from the road onto rugs that had crossed oceans. Jacob, me, stood in the hall with the other servants, head bowed, eyes lowered, ears open. Edmund greeted men with the grip of a conspirator. I have something to show you after dinner, he promised, as though cruelty were a new invention he would unveil. Robert basked in his own celebration, laughing too loud, filling the air with stories of discipline and science. Elizabeth fluttered to the music room, boasting of a new song she had learned. Catherine drifted quietly, smile fixed, her eyes half clouded. In the kitchen, Martha's twisted hands worked the rhythm of the feast. Roll, baste, stir, plate. Samuel poured wine with trembling dignity, each movement practiced over decades. I moved silently among them, carrying plates, catching fragments of talk. Profits measured in cotton, uprisings crushed, children sold for their own good. Their words rose like steam, foul but invisible to themselves. The table stretched long. Roasted birds lay golden, skin crackling. Boar glistened with honey glaze. Oysters sat like jewels on beds of salt. Forks chimed, candles burned low, and the room filled with the smell of wealth bought in blood. When the meal ended, the men retired to Edmund's study. Journals waited on the desk, pages open to fresh cruelties. Edmund read like a professor. Observe the spirit when a child is deprived of sleep. Observe the obedience that follows hunger. Heads nodded, cigars flared, one man muttered, remarkable. The women moved to the music room. Elizabeth played bright notes that carried no joy. Catherine listened, her soft smile drifting in laudanum haze. Gossip stitched itself out of thin fabric. Whose plantation thrived, whose slaves misbehaved, whose fortunes grew fat. By midnight, some guests left for home. Carriages rattled into the night. 6 couples remained, trusting Blackwood hospitality enough to sleep under its roof. Their trust was the last mistake they ever made. By one, the halls hushed. Doors closed. The study quieted. The music ceased. Candles sputtered. The mansion exhaled into silence. I washed the last goblet slowly, watching the way flames shortened in their holders. The house felt heavy yet ready. I measured each breath against the quiet around me. At 2, the room settled. Snores drifted down the hall. At 3, the house belonged to me. I collected the knife honed to a whisper, the rope coiled like a secret, the matches that burned only when called. The weight of them steadied me. Outside, frogs croaked in the swamp. Inside, a clock ticked faithfully, marking the hour no one would forget. The dinner party had ended. The real feast was about to begin. The second-floor corridor stretched long and narrow, lined with doors like ribs on a spine. Behind each door, breath rose and fell in sleep, unaware the night had turned against them. I moved like smoke. The knife was warm in my palm, rope coiled at my side. The house creaked in its usual language, but I knew when to pause, when to step, when to wait for the clock to tick. First door, Colonel Morrison. His room smelled of cologne and coal. Moonlight spilled across the rug. He snored, certain that sleep owed him safety. His wife lay curled toward the wall, fingers tucked beneath her cheek. I stood over them, listening to the rhythm of their breaths. Then the knife slid across his throat, quick, clean, final. His eyes opened wide at the cold but never found words. His wife stirred, mouth parting for a scream. My hand silenced it, steel pressing to her chest. 2 lives ended before Dawn had the chance to notice. Second door, Judge Whitfield. Alone since his young wife had stayed home. He opened his eyes when the hinge whispered. Recognition flickered. He knew my face but not my purpose, until the blade taught him. A judge who had signed away families left the world without gavel or defense. Third door, Dr. Hartwell. He had a pistol at his bedside, hand quick, but panic makes quick hands clumsy. The blade bit his wrist, the pistol clattered like a guilty thing. His shout rose, thin and sharp, then cut short. He fought because some men must believe they tried. The carpet drank the proof. Others followed. Merchants who smiled while weighing children like sacks, bankers who counted ship holds as collateral, lawyers who blessed contracts that turned blood into numbers. Room by room, the ledger balanced. I did not hurry for speed. I hurried for order. Each door had its sound. Each bed its pattern. Each face its last look, and I did not keep them. They were debts being paid, nothing more. By 4 the corridor felt different. Air grows strange when it remembers it can leave. The house seemed lighter, then heavier, then still. I listened for feet, for cries, for alarm. None came. Only silence stretched, deeper than before. I wiped the blade on linen bought with profit. The fabric stained as it should. Then I climbed toward the 3rd floor. Robert's door was locked, but locks teach arrogance when they are not tested. I slid through easily. A candle burned low on his desk, his journal open, his hand scribbling. He muttered to himself, measuring suffering even in ink. He didn't hear the door. He heard only my voice. Fascinating reading? I asked. The candle spat. Robert jerked upright, chair scraping, eyes wide. He reached for the pistol. My blade struck first, shoulder deep, enough to teach pain before silence. He screamed, young and foolish again, begging with words that once commanded. He promised freedom, gold, papers, anything. I pointed to his journal. That is what you are, I said. This is what you made. He tried to stand. The knife corrected him. When he stilled, I pinched the candle's flame between 2 fingers, taking the burn as a small tax. Down again to the 2nd floor. The long rug waited with its final door. The Blackwood still slept. Not for long. The hour had come when midnight turned to judgment. Edmund and Catherine slept in a bed that had never known bad news. Curtains heavy, silk sheets smooth, the master and mistress lay tangled in dreams where obedience lasted forever. The hinges whispered as I opened the door. Moonlight stretched across the room, silver on the floor, pale across Edmund's face. His eyes opened into the steel before he could form a word. Jacob, he croaked, voice dry but still carrying command. Put the knife down. I almost laughed. He thought names were cages, thought his voice could bind me. But I had already slipped those chains. I'm speaking your language, I told him. And the blade answered for me. One cut quick and sure. His blood spread across the silk, making it honest. Catherine woke into clarity sharper than she had ever shown in life. The laudanum fog burned away when her eyes found Edmund's throat. Her scream filled the room, a sound she had never allowed herself when others suffered. I gave her the ending she never gave to anyone else. Her chest fell still, her hand clutching Edmund's. Cruelty bound them together in life. Death did the same. On the stair to the 3rd floor, I met my own breath rising. It was steady, calm, measured. I unlocked Robert's door once more, though I already knew the outcome. The journal on his desk sat open, mid-sentence, never to be finished. His body slumped where I had left it. Justice had already passed through this room. That left Elizabeth. Her chamber smelled of flowers and smoke, sweet, cloying, already rotting. She had been awake for minutes that felt like hours, listening to silence and learning its meaning. When I stepped into the room, her eyes were wide, her beauty stripped to terror. "Stay away," she whispered. Vanity was gone. Fear made her plain. "You taught me to be careful," I said. My voice was steady. "You taught me to be exact." She bolted from the bed, feet bare, hair loose, nightdress tangling at her knees. She ran because the body always believes in running, even when the mind knows there is no escape. I caught her at the threshold, hand clamped on her throat, the same way she had once clamped the iron on Lucy's skin. I didn't stretch the moment. I didn't dress it with words. I gave her the name she had stolen, the name she had scarred into memory. Lucy. The knife finished what the iron had begun. Elizabeth crumpled, her blood mixing with perfume, her last breath as shallow as her laughter had once been cruel. When she fell, the house changed. I felt it. The hiss that had haunted every wall, every floorboard, every night. It stopped. The mansion was no longer a machine for suffering. It was only wood, stone, and silence again. I stood in the hall, knife slick in my hand, rope hanging loose. The house listened with me. No orders, no screams, no laughter. Only the slow work of my lungs, proof that I was still alive. I did not smile. I did not kneel. I breathed steady and true. The Blackwoods were gone. Their empire had ended in their own beds. The ledger was almost balanced. Almost. Justice written is not justice felt. Words alone could not erase what the Blackwoods had carved into flesh and soil. Their cruelty had been preserved in journals, in ledgers, in neat columns of ink. To end them, I had to end their record. I walked to Edmund's study, the place where pain had been catalogued like harvest yields. His journals waited on the desk, pages heavy with years of cold observations. Beside them lay ledgers of trade, contracts that turned lives into numbers, receipts of children sold, families split. On the wall, portraits of smug ancestors stared down in charcoal frames. I pulled the journals one by one, stacked them in the hearth like kindling. The ledgers followed, then letters, then the portraits. Each page, each face, each line of ink was fuel. I built the fire like a sermon. From my pocket came the match, one of many stolen, hidden, saved. I struck it. The sound was small, but in the silence of that house it cracked like thunder. Flame touched paper, paper touched wood, and hunger leapt alive. Flame behaves like a choir. First one voice, then more, until harmony finds itself. The drapes caught, then the rug, then the very air above the hearth shimmered and turned to light. Smoke rolled along the ceiling. The study became a furnace. I moved room to room, offering the fire new doors, new voices. Curtains in the parlor, rugs in the hall, bedding in the guest rooms. The mansion had swallowed screams for years. Now it swallowed flame. Outside, the night changed color. The white columns glowed like bones inside a lantern. Windows coughed sparks. The roof groaned, then roared, timbers splitting under heat. Peacocks shrieked in the yard. Dogs barked and would not stop. I stood in the field and watched. 30 years of cruelty lifted into smoke. You cannot whisper what flame can shout. Across the delta, other houses stirred. Faces pressed against windows. Riders mounted horses. Soon they would come, drawn by the glow, the smell, the panic. They would bring questions, guns, prayers. But they would not find me. The fire spread faster than the night could carry news. Rafters collapsed, walls leaned inward, glass shattered outward. The great Blackwood mansion, once so proud, folded like parchment left too close to a candle. I turned once toward the quarters, toward the little hill where Lucy lay. Smoke drifted that way, soft as a hymn. I said her name without sound. She was part of the fire now, part of the ash that would choke the empire. By dawn the house was gone. The fields around it shimmered with heat, blackened with falling ash. What had been order and cruelty was nothing but ruin. I walked into the dark, leaving the fire to speak for me. The delta had a new story and it glowed against the horizon. Morning found ash where silk had been. The mansion was nothing but blackened beams, smoking walls, and columns that glowed red like bones after a burial fire. Men on horseback circled the ruin like crows with reins in their hands. Their faces were tight, their mouths full of questions they didn't dare speak too loudly. The sheriff arrived with a handkerchief pressed to his nose, scribbling words onto paper as though ink could restore order. He called it accident at first, then tragedy, then finally murder when the bodies were counted. 16 in all. The names filled the town windows by noon, each followed by a reward notice. $5,000? More money than most would ever see. That price hung in the air like a stench. Bounty hunters saddled up. Planters sharpened their fears. Dogs were loosed along the riverbanks. They searched everywhere. The swamp, where Maroons lived free in hidden camps. The roads north, where whispers said the Underground Railroad might carry a man beyond reach. The river itself, dark and deep, as if it might hold a secret willingly. None of them gave an answer. The quarters spoke softer now, but not silent. They whispered of me. Some said I had run north under cover of the fire, papers forged in smoke. Some said I had slipped into the swamp, joining the ones who built their own nations out of mud and courage. Others swore I had walked back into the fire itself, learning how to burn without being seen. The planters wrote letters full of outrage, demanding vengeance. The governor wanted a body, mine. None would do. Banks asked about insurance. Churches asked for calm. Newspapers chose their words carefully: fiend, monster, butcher. Easier names than mirror. Across the county something new took root. Keys moved closer to pillows. Knots found new uses. Masters who had never looked over their shoulders now did. Wives hushed their gossip when shadows shifted in doorways. Children woke at night, asking why their fathers walked the halls with pistols drawn. They searched for me through the summer, then the fall, then into the next spring. But I did not appear. Because a boy who learns to move like smoke goes where air goes. He slips through cracks, over rivers, into forests. You only notice him when the light hits just right. Jacob the slave was gone. The butcher of Mississippi remained, untouched, unseen, a scar across the delta that no one could heal. The Blackwood land lay empty for years. Not because the soil could not grow cotton, but because memory had rooted deeper than seeds. Grass crept over the path to the front door that no longer stood. Vines crawled over bricks blackened by fire. Children dared each other to run to the broken steps, to touch the ash stain and run back before dark. Some did. Others walked slowly, listening as if the house might still whisper. In the quarters, the old voices sang new lines into old songs. Not with names that could draw punishment, but with shapes you could feel. A boy who turned silence into a blade. A scar that became a banner. A girl named Lucy who no longer cried. Their names folded into hymns, hummed low at night, slipped into prayers, carried across cotton rows. The story survived where books could not. Other planters learned their own lessons. Some built higher fences. Some hired meaner overseers. They wrote stricter rules, prayed longer prayers, carried pistols closer to their beds. But rules only walk where fear leads them, and fear had learned a new road. The fire spread in ways no bucket could stop. It spread in memory, in caution, in the way a master's voice cracked when silence stretched too long. They called me monster, butcher, fiend, names that let them sleep. But when their children asked why the dogs barked at night, they whispered another name: Jacob. The Blackwood Plantation never returned. The wilderness claimed it. Wind carried ash into the river, into the fields, into the lungs of those who swore they would forget. But the land did not forget. It kept its scar. Years later, travelers wrote about the ruin. Some said the ground felt colder near the old foundation. Others said the air carried a faint hiss, like a house still breathing. But those who knew the story, the ones who had carried it in song, said the hiss was gone. What remained was witness. Because oppression breeds its enemy with patient hands. Teach a child cruelty, and one day he will return it in a tongue you finally understand. You can call him monster if it helps you sleep. But the river remembers another word: witness. This is why the story of the butcher of Mississippi was buried. Not because it was false, but because it was true. Because it reminded the powerful that fear cuts both ways, and silence, once sharpened, can strike deeper than any whip. 16 bodies. One night. A house turned to ash. A boy they thought broken. A boy who waited. A boy who rose. And though history tried to erase him, though rewards were posted and words were written, Jacob remained where ink could not reach. In whispers. In songs. In the silence that kept masters awake at night, that silence still walks the delta.